Is the Cold War really over? Vladimir Putin warns new missiles could be built after Donald Trump announced he was pulling out of a nuclear weapons treaty. Is another arms race about to start? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle Carey. It's 27 years since the end of the Cold War, but the heat is on again between the United States and Russia over missiles and nuclear weapons. Donald Trump is accusing the Russians of violating a 31-year-old arms treaty and says the U.S. is pulling out. Vladimir Putin says if he does, the Kremlin will build new missiles. Let's hear what he's been saying.
In the current context, the INF Treaty acts as a stabilizing factor and works to maintain a certain level of predictability and restraint in the military sector. In case the treaty is broken by the United States, we will have to take additional measures to enhance our security. If we have such air-based and sea-based missile systems, it wouldn't be hard to do research and to deploy them on the ground if needed.
The U.S. Secretary of State announced Trump's treaty decision earlier this month.
The list of Russia's infamous acts is long. Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, election meddling, Skripal, and now the Kerch Strait, to name just a few. In light of these facts, the United States today declares it has found Russia in material breach of the treaty and will suspend our obligations as a remedy effective in 60 days unless Russia returns to full and verifiable compliance.
So what is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty? It was signed in Washington 31 years ago by U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader before the fall of the Soviet Union. The Cold War enemies agreed to eliminate all their stocks of short and medium-range missiles, including nuclear weapons. Seaside launch missiles are the only exceptions. The aim was to reduce the threat of war, especially in Europe. The INF Treaty is considered a milestone in ending the arms race between the Cold War superpowers. So over to the panel. Joining us in Moscow is Pavel Felgenhauer, a defense and military analyst. In London, through Skype, James Nixey, head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. And finally, Lawrence Korb, in D.C., that is, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. Welcome to all of you. I appreciate it very much. Lawrence, I'm going to start with you. How concerning is this development, this language, at a time that NATO is expanding, at a time that Russia is doing things like annexing Crimea? How concerned are you?
Well, I'm very concerned, not just because the president has announced that we're going to get out of the INF Treaty, but he has not accepted President Putin's offer to extend New START, which expires in 2021. It can be extended 5 years without ratification by the Senate or the Russian Duma. If the INF goes away and the START agreement goes away, we're back to a new arms race. It'll be the first time since 1972 we haven't had any strategic treaties with the Soviet Union or Russia.
Actually, I'm glad you brought up START. I was going to bring it up later, but let's just jump right into that. James, are you concerned that if the INF goes away, that START might be next?
Well, of course, there's a tendency here to abrogate from agreements or violate them, depending on your point of view, or suspend them. And if you're without any arms control agreements whatsoever, then the world is inherently a more unstable place. At least during the original Cold War, if you like, then there was a system of understandings which was indeed backed up by treaties which were, by and large, respected. That is actually not the case anymore. We see a more aggressive Russia and a more unpredictable United States. So actually, we are in a more dangerous situation than any time since 1963.
Pavel, how concerned are you?
Well, arms control, as we knew it before, it seems to be just going out the window. Well, that most likely, this is most likely was inevitable because these treaties, beginning with the INF in 87, they formalized the end of the Cold War. And if now it's back again, that means these treaties are rather already irrelevant. and most likely they would go in one way or another. But the way they're right now being abrogated really leaves the field open for a free-for-all arms race, which most likely is going to destabilize the situation internationally, destabilize the existing nuclear balance between the two nuclear superpowers, and will make the world a much more dangerous place.
Pavel, you say that these treaties, that the INF, and I assume perhaps you mean START as well, you say they're irrelevant now. Why?
Well, they reflected what was achieved in the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, the end of the Cold War, the demise of the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, the end of the standoff between East and West, and now we have a new standoff between East and West. That means these treaties are irrelevant. Some kind of new balance should be found, most likely. But before that is found, there's going to be a period, it seems, of unlimited arms race on both sides, and then maybe the two sides will decide that it's cheaper to settle down and put down some rules. But there are people in Washington, clearly, and apparently in Moscow, some too, which believe that arms control as we knew it is not really a good thing, and it's maybe will be all better without it.
Okay, Lawrence, let me ask you, is there ever a time that arms control is not a good thing?
No, absolutely not. I think, if anything, we can work out the Russian violations of the INF Treaty and also deal with what their complaints. They're complaining that the missile defense systems we're putting in Poland and Romania can be used for offensive purposes. We ought to let them inspect in return for us inspecting this RM-729, which is the Russian agreement. And what we ought to do is not only extend New START, we ought to bring China into the negotiations now, because they have developed intermediate range missiles, and they are becoming an increasing factor in the international system. So that's what we ought to do, not get rid of it, expand it. And this idea that you can have arms control if the other side, for example, the Russians in Crimea, we can't do it. No, that's absolutely wrong. During the Cold War, we had started in 1972 with the first arms reduction treaty. Right after that, the Russians went into Afghanistan. We didn't say, well, we're going to get rid of them. No, it's a separate issue. And I think because of the destruction that can be caused by these things, you have to deal with that even when you have disagreements in other areas.
We're actually going to circle back to China. I'm glad you brought that up. But first, James, I want to put this question to you. These accusations that Russia has been violating this treaty actually goes back to the Obama administration, and it seems as if they didn't deal with it. Russia, clearly says they're not. Is it really up for debate whether or not Russia is violating the treaty?
No, it's not really up for debate. That has been proven. Evidence has been submitted and subsequently ignored by the Russian side. But I think that said, of course, the Obama administration did call the Russians out on this twice, in particular, and that's all that they did. There was no action. So I agree with the previous speaker that it's important to expand the INF Treaty with the rise of China. But the fact of the matter is that by disbanding it altogether, then you have nothing whatsoever. So really, the penalty for abrogation, the penalty for non-compliance should be something along the lines of increased sanctions. It shouldn't be to cut it off altogether. That would make a lot more sense, and it would keep the world safer. But you wanted to come to China, if I may, very briefly, then I think that the fact that China can produce, is allowed to produce, intermediate range nuclear missiles, and Russia and the US are theoretically not, is perhaps one of the reasons why this treaty has been withdrawn from unilaterally.
Let's go ahead and talk about China then. Pavel, what about that? Should this treaty, this type of treaty, also now, because you said that before it's not really as relevant, times have changed, absolutely. So should a treaty like this include China? And if so, what motivation would China have to actually agree to be part of a treaty like this?
Well, about 10 years ago in 07, 08, there was a Russian-American attempt to expand the treaty with China. China said it's not interested. Just today, in a big interview published by Sergei Ryabkov, who's the deputy foreign minister in charge of arms control, he said that there are no talks with China about including it in the treaty and that this is a dead issue and Russia is not interested right now. I mean, they're not doing anything about it. They're not talking to the Chinese. And he also said that Russia has rejected American requests to inspect this 9M729 missile. So it seems that both sides are sort of digging their heels in. There doesn't seem much room for any meaningful compromise right now.
Lawrence, what is it that the U.S. wants?
Well, I think what the U.S. wants, basically, there's a difference between the U.S., if I can say that, and the Trump administration.
Fair enough.
Because of the presence of John Bolton, the national security advisor. He doesn't believe in arms control. He was the one who pushed President Bush to get out of the ABM treaty, and he developed what we call the SWORD agreement, which was like 2 pages. It wasn't until Obama came in that you got a meaningful strategic arms treaty. I think what we want, basically, is to continue the period of arms control. And while my colleague in Russia says that, they're not interested, no, Putin's the one who wants to extend New START. And what's also involved here, and if you don't and you get into this arms race, it's going to be very expensive. And given the Russian economy, it's going to be tougher on them than, say, the United States.
James, what is an arms race at its core, really about?
Well, what it's really about is, I suppose, what we used to call in the Cold War mutually assured destruction, that you build up enough forces so that each side is massively disincentivized from firing because it would mean mutual destruction. But again, I can't help but agree with a previous speaker that that is actually well nigh impossible for Russia in particular, which has an economy, only a fifth or the 11th, depending upon whether you use GDP or PPP, the largest in the world. And that it is simply not sustainable for Russia to enter into an arms race. Russian nationalists will tell you that the money will always be found because it's a mobilization economy and that will drive it. But the reality is that Russia can only sustain an arms build-up for another sort of 10 or so years. The Russian military has professionalized, it has improved, but the nuclear forces are in need of modernization, they are rusting, and that's going to be very difficult to do come the middle of the next decade.
Pavel, Vladimir Putin is obviously not Mikhail Gorbachev, obviously. Previous secretaries of state had said that the collapse of the Soviet Union is part of Vladimir Putin's psyche. It's the prism through which he views the world. Do you agree with that? How do you think that's at play in some of the decisions and the things that he says now?
Well, yes. I mean, Putin has many times said that we will not allow ourselves to be pulled into a new arms race. We won't go down the same drain that the Soviet Union did. But on the other side of it, there are very influential, entrenched interest in Russia, in Moscow, the military-industrial complex, diplomats of the old school and of the new one, actually, too, who believe that a kind of arms race of sorts and a standoff with the United States would be maybe good for them. And that means a détente would mean that defense spending would be cut. But right now, there's no détente. That means the defense spending is going to stay on the same level. And the military, technically, right now, abrogating the INF is more in Russians' favor because the United States doesn't have any missiles it could deploy, but is not deploying because there's a treaty there. While Russia does have, and it's much cheaper, 20 times cheaper to deploy the same cruise missiles on a truck than on a frigate or a corvette, because a truck is 20 times cheaper to procure and to maintain. So that makes sense to the Russian military to kind of move out of the INF and at the same time blame the Americans for being the guys who abrogated it.
So, Lawrence, I want to put a similar question to you to see if you agree. What do you think is at play, having watched Vladimir Putin for all these years? What's at play for him to speak this way, and how does it benefit him? How does it benefit Russia?
Well, I think basically President Putin is trying to restore Russia to what he sees as its historical destiny, and that the end of the Cold War was just a temporary aberration. And, you know, for example, Ukraine had been part of Russia at one time, and so he feels that it was perfectly legitimate to annex Crimea. So I think that's what he wants to do, and he's temporarily getting away with it, as my colleague in Russia has pointed out. But at some point, it's going to be very difficult for him to maintain this, given the way his economy is going and the dependence upon the oil market. You saw what happened when he raised the retirement age in Russia. There were, people were very, very, very upset. So he can get away with it for a while. But I think the fact that he has offered to extend New START tells me he recognizes that you don't want to have a full arms race again. He would rather put his money into conventional forces. And the Trump administration hasn't helped anything, because in their new nuclear posture review, they want to develop 2 new types of nuclear weapons that would, again, create more problems than it would solve. And the colleague from Russia is correct. We have plenty of cruise missiles that we can use from ships and planes, so really we don't need them in Europe. And that's why it makes sense to sit down and talk to the Russians about this. If people forget, during the ABM treaty, there was concern that the Russians had a second site, but we were able to deal with that. And paradoxically, Gorbachev admitted that they had violated it, but really was not something that you want to start a whole new arms race over.
James, do you see any type of opening for there actually being a negotiation? The U.S. has set out this deadline that, it's 60 days, and if things don't get better in 60 days, they say that they're going to give 6 months notice and walk. Before we get to all that, 60 days can be a lot of time. Do you actually see anything changing in that time?
Not especially. It doesn't seem to be in the mood, or it's certainly not the way the trend is going. The culture of denial is very strong in Russia. The culture, it's very important. The pride, the need not to back down, not to retreat on any single issue, not to admit that one was wrong or that one is facing a problem is very strong in Russia. So I don't think that the Russians are really in the mood for any kind of retreat. They're just going to try. It's a kind of a game of chicken in a way, and they're looking to see who will blink first. But this is really part of a much wider struggle between Russia and the West right now, where, as Warren said, you're looking at a Russia which, although massively weakened economically, still regards itself as deserving a seat at the top table, one of 3, the US, Russia, and now China. And it will do anything. That is the most important thing for Russia. It's not the prosperity of its people, it's not security of its borders. It is to ensure that Russia is one of those great powers deciding on all major affairs of international relations. So this particular fallout, this particular treaty abrogation is one element of a much wider dispute, whereby Russia believes it is analogous to the US. And that is really only true insofar as numbers of nuclear weapons are concerned, ironically.
Pavel, I'm interested in your take on that. Is this about Russia and Vladimir Putin insisting that they deserve a seat at the table with the U.S. and other countries? Is that what this is about?
Oh, well, yes, partially, yes. Of course, Russia believes that it is a great power, should be reckoned with, and that the West is trying to kind of isolate Russia, move it to the side, cordon it off somewhere in the steppes of Eurasia and make it irrelevant. But there are also other things internally which are very important when you consider Russian foreign policy and defense policy decision-making. There's the so-called economic liberal part of Putin's administration and government who are clamoring actually to stop this standoff with the West, to cut defense spending, which are opposed to the defense industrial complex. So there's a lot of infighting within the Russian administration, within the Russian ruling smallish elite. But they are, I mean, these people are all loyal to Putin, sort of, but they have incompatible understandings and beliefs on where Russia should go and how it should develop. So you should always take into account that Washington is split, but Moscow is also split. And that should be taken into account when analyzing why Russia does this or that. Sometimes it's just the result of an internal fight, and then Putin makes some kind of decision for one side or the other.
Lawrence,
right now, we're moving into a direction that's going to be very, very much increasing tensions.
Okay. Lawrence, when we're talking about increasing tension, Russia becoming more aggressive, are you concerned that the Trump administration, and I'm glad you made the distinction between DC and the Trump administration, that sometimes even the Trump administration is not of one mind, they're often unpredictable, not always seen as stable. How does that play into all of this?
Well, it's very difficult to negotiate with an administration that doesn't, can I use it, have its act together or is not speaking, with one voice. I mean, the president might tweet something without checking with the Secretary of Defense, for example, and that makes it difficult. But right now you have a tremendous advantage. Putin was the one who suggested extending New START. Say, okay, we'll do that. Then we got to clear up this thing with the INF. And by the way, why do we want to stay at 1,550 strategic nuclear weapons? Let's go down to 1,000. You can save some money and we can save some money. The new incoming chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, said even the United States, which obviously has a much bigger economy than Russia, we can't afford to modernize our strategic as well as, rebuild our conventional forces. So that you ought to seize this opportunity. He's the great deal maker. If he could bring something like that off, his place in history would, really be solidified.
James, worst case scenario that this doesn't get all worked out, what do you think the consequences will be?
Well, worst case scenario is thermonuclear war, but let's not go there.
Let's not.
Worst case, the real worst case scenario is actually that relations barrel out even further than they are, that you lose diplomatic relations, that there's a new, some form of accident somewhere, miscalculation, and actually you do get, maybe not, again, not full-scale nuclear war, but you do get some form of shooting match between the sides, maybe over the NATO-Russia border, for example, possibly. But don't forget, this is already happening. Russia does actually believe itself already to be at war with the West. And for Russia, the military means of war is only 1/4 of warfare. The rest of it is what is sometimes called hybrid warfare. In other words, non-linear, non-kinetic warfare, whereby you are undermining the opposition through these other means. And that is already happening. You don't need me to tell you. So again, we're already there. We need to stop it going into that last quarter of warfare.
And thank you, James Nixey. That will be the last word. Thank you all for this conversation. I'm sure that we will be discussing this again in the next 60 days, and we'll call on you. Appreciate it very much. Thank you all. Again, Pavel Felgenhauer, James Nixey, and Lawrence Korb. And thank you all for watching. You can see the program again anytime if you visit our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team. Bye for now.